Red at the Bone. And I think a little fun fact is I actually met Jonathan Woodson once while waiting in line for a movie.
So if you guys maybe you want to put in your favorite author or book into the Zoom chat, introduce yourselves, just so we get familiar. That'd be great. Or you can also
cameras on.
Yeah. You can also unmute yourselves to say as well. Hi, Barbara.
Hi, I'm Barbara Kuzak. I guess I go to Jacek Malczewski School of Fine Arts, which is in Poland. So that's, if anyone is wondering why it's a mash of just letters mashed together. But my favorite author is Bruno Schulz, and my favorite book by him is The Crocodile Street, which is just an amazing collection of short stories. It's full of sorry if I'm rambling, but it's full of poetic prose and mysticism and mythization, and I really can't recommend it enough.
Awesome. I'm writing that down. Crocodile Street. Oh, I see some people in the chat. Nice to hear from you, Will.
I guess I'm Ian Breuer. I'm a freshman at US. I guess favorite author is probably Ursula K. Le Guin. I've not read enough of her stuff, but I really, really like The Left Hand of Darkness. It's really good.
Cool.
I guess we'll go next. I'm a freshman at St. Anne's, and my favorite author is probably Siddhartha Mukherjee.
Okay, should we just begin?
Yeah, why not? So we're going to give you, I guess, a brief overview of the sessions, the coming sessions.
Yeah, so welcome to session 1. This is the inaugural event of the inaugural online literary festival. Today we have 2 writers coming to talk, Radhika Jha and Philip Gourevitch. Jha is a novelist, and we're going to mainly be discussing her book, Smell. And Gourevitch is an NYR writer and a past editor of the Paris Review. And he also did a lot of work for the, in reporting the Rwandan genocide, which we will also be discussing. Tonight is Teju Cole, and we're going to be mainly talking about his book, Open City, that came out like 10-ish years ago, which is about a man wandering around NYC and just his thoughts about loneliness and about isolation in such a big city. He also has an essay collection that's rather famous called Known and Strange Things. Tomorrow morning is Leo Damrosch, who is an American writer and Harvard professor, and he's written numerous biographies, and we're mainly going to be discussing his work on those biographies, and also like just the history of novels and of literature. And then tomorrow night at 6 p.m. is Bruce Speiler, who is an American novelist most known for his memoir, The Council of Dads.
Awesome. So I guess for our individual session today, and I guess for the rest of the sessions to come, we're going to start off by, I guess, interviewing the authors. But after the interviews, we want to remind you first to, I guess, keep in mind that there will be opportunities to ask the authors questions yourselves after we interview them live. So I guess it's a good idea to maybe grab a pen and paper and I guess to write down or keep in mind anything that interests you from the interviews, any inspiration for questions. And then after the Q&A session, We will also have writing exercises, which we wrote prompts inspired off of the author's work.
Also, just to kind of give a summary of Smell, the book that Radhika, when she comes, is going to be reading an excerpt from, and we'll be asking her about. Smell is about a woman who, as a young girl, moves from Africa to Europe to the suburbs of Paris, and it's about just the life of a young immigrant, and of just not knowing where you are and what's in store for you. Max, if you want to add more.
Yeah, I guess it deals with themes of powerlessness, racism, and her coming of age and sexuality in, I guess, a foreign city. Also, I also want to mention that it's for Zoom etiquette, I guess, or literary festival. Our ideal, I guess the ideal would be to have all of you, a way for you all to participate when we're not having our Q&A session or writing exercises, would to be active in the Zoom chat. One way to do this would be when our authors are reading excerpts of their work, or we are reading excerpts of their work, to, I guess, jump in the Zoom chat, type out some lines that you thought were particularly interesting or exciting, and comment, I guess, on things that are interesting in the Zoom chat.
Okay, I think we'll just kind of jump right in, because now Ms. Jha is here. I'll just give a small introduction to who she is. Radhika Jha was born and raised in India, and she studied anthropology at Amherst and did her master's in poli-sci at Chicago. And she lived in Paris as an exchange student for a while too. She began her career as a journalist and worked for the Hindustan Times and Business World, writing on culture, the environment, and the economy. She also worked for the Rajiv Gandhi Foundation, where she began the Interact project for the education of children of victims of terrorism in different parts of India. Her debut novel, Smell, which we'll be talking about today, details the coming of age of Leela, a young Indian woman who emigrates from Kenya to Paris. The book deals with themes of racism, sexuality, and powerlessness. Ms. Jha's other works are Lantern on the Horn and My Beautiful Shadow. Now it's our honor to welcome Radhika Jha, who will tell us a little about what writing means to her, and then we'll read an excerpt from her novel, Smell.
Okay, hi everybody. Nice to be with you. I'm in Delhi, I'm in India. So it's even more fun. What can I say? I don't know. I mean, I think when I think of myself, I think I kind of stumbled into becoming a writer, really, because I had appendicitis. I was like 25, 26, and I had an emergency operation, and then I was, and the thing ruptured, and there was all this nasty stuff all over my body. And so I was on a lot of antibiotics, and I was forced to stay at home and recuperate for about 4 or 5 weeks. And I was really bored, because in those days in India, there was not much, there was no Netflix. And I remember there was just kind of Bold and Beautiful, one horrible serial. And there was that and one other, who I don't even remember, which was even worse. And that's all you could see. And it was really, the TV was very boring. And so I had not much choice. And I'd kind of read most of the books that I had at that point. And I was weak, so I didn't even really feel like reading. So I was thinking, what should I do? And I was bored and I was grouchy. And then my dad just said, look, why don't you actually give yourself a project? Why don't you try writing something? Because you always sort of start things, and just take anything that you've written at some point and just try to make it go as long as you can and as far as you can, and just see what happens. And of course, first I had to tell him that he was a complete idiot, and that of course he didn't understand at all what I was going through. But then afterwards, I sort of thought, yeah, that makes sense. And I started writing, and that is what became Smell, actually, the book that I'm supposed to read a little excerpt from. And But I love reading. I mean, since I didn't have so much Netflix to distract me, I think my life was easier just because books were the one way that I managed to really escape. And I think really today the whole discussion has to be framed by Netflix, let's face it, or not Netflix or any one of these, these streaming things, because that's changed our world completely. Because everything has to be now framed in terms of what am I going to see on the screen, or is this really worth reading rather than being on the screen? So I think it's a tough time for books. It's a tough time for reading, and I really don't know. I mean, I have nothing except sort of great admiration for anyone who actually reads today, because it's not easy. There's too much, you read your telephones, you read your your web feeds and all the rest of it, and you read for class. And then it's really, I think it's kind of sad that one has to read books for class in English. You read books in English language classes, and then some teacher kind of sets some rather abstruse kind of question, and you have to answer that. It kind of takes away the fun of reading and discovering books, at least for me. Because I see my kids going through this, and I just think how sad. I loved that book, but then I never had to write a paper on it. Yay. So I really feel a lot of sympathy for you. And I think the only way out is maybe to decide, okay, I'm going to read about countries I know nothing about, foreign countries that teachers will not recommend to me to read. And because that's actually great, you really can escape, you escape into the skin of a person, of a place, especially a person and place, I'd say, with books. And that's kind of, for me, more and more, I kind of use writing, because I'm also watching Netflix a lot or something, some clone of that. So I realized that the book is actually a way of, I'm reading much more sort of books which were written in another historical period, or fantasy, or books written from other countries. So I'm reading a lot of Chinese, Japanese, African authors, because Indian authors, of course, but, because I know that I'm not going to see that on Netflix. So I guess that's what I have to say about reading. And it's worth it, because I think when you read a book, you get under the skin of a character, you live with that person. And I think that makes us more empathetic. And if there's one thing that's really missing in today's world, and it's going to be missing even more, is empathy, because we're all getting much more fragmented and lonely and dealing with the world through the computer. So I hope that's okay.
Awesome.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks
That
so
was
much.
amazing. And I think you're reading an excerpt from Smell. I think we chose one that I think really emphasized the beauty of your book. And smell itself, I guess, because that's kind of what the book is about. It's about and about taste and about, yeah.
So I guess if you in the Zoom chat, if you guys want to jump on any sentences that you find particularly vivid or exciting, I guess comment on them in the Zoom chat as well. So I think we're going to share also the PDF for you guys to follow along.
Okay, that's perfect. That's great. I almost had a panic attack because I couldn't find the section in my copy, which is this copy. It's like the hardcover of the Soho Press edition, which is actually the American edition, I think. Yeah. Yep. So,
Actually, yeah.
Yeah.
I guess it's on page from
193 in my book, I think.
193.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Awesome.
Okay. So here goes. This was written for me. It was written when I was 26 years old, so it's a while back. Huh? So when I read it now, I feel a little embarrassed, but hey. I became aware that I was in the middle of a spice bazaar. I burst into a slightly hysterical laughter at the familiar sight of chilies of all colors, sizes, and shapes hanging in huge clusters from the awnings of wooden carts. Cinnamon, cardamom, pepper in shades of red, yellow, and orange, turmeric, coriander, ginger, and garlic were all heaped onto multicolored wheelbarrows. And between the wheelbarrows sat life-sized dolls in brightly colored costumes from the countries where the spices came from. and stacks of earthenware pots and strangely shaped spoons and dishes in brass and copper. I thought of the dingy back room in my uncle's grocery store. I shut my eyes and inhaled deeply, wanting to absorb the different flavors of the beautiful spices. I could smell nothing but a faint, dusty aroma at first. Then, hesitantly, the smell of the spices came to me. But they were meek and frightened, not the powerful, self-confident sense that had demolished the smell of French bread so efficiently in my uncle's shop. Here, the buttery smells of the nearby bakery section were far more overpowering. I shook my head, frowning. "What's the matter?" Philippe asked, staring anxiously at my face. "What's wrong?" "They have no smell, or very little smell," I amended, not wanting to hurt his feelings. His face cleared. "So what?" he said, taking my arm. "They look good, don't they? No one in all Europe has ever managed to sell spices to the French except me." "But they have to have a smell. How do you cook if they don't smell? How can you tell if it's good?" "You don't need to smell to taste. What difference does it make, as long as they taste correct?" I began to laugh. He looked so grumpy, exactly like a little boy who had been told that there was something he couldn't have. "These have no smell. You cannot cook properly if you cannot smell the spices. You cannot taste either, for the taste begins in the nose, doesn't it? In that case, my dear, I should hate food because I cannot smell very well. I never have been able to since I was a child. But I know my food. Forget your silly theories. They only show your ignorance." I had hurt him, I realized. Suddenly I saw him as he was in the flesh, a heavy, middle-aged man with his eyes planted too close together and his face running to fat. I felt a surge of pity. As I watched his face, the anger went out of it and was replaced by desire. "You look lovely when you're angry," he said softly. I became aware of the hot sausage-sweet smell of him. It reached out to grab me. I began to back away, but the smell was faster. It encircled me. I turned and walked blindly through the aisles by golden bags of coffee beans and crystal jars of honey in every shade from rusty red to straw gold. I ducked behind a wall of Parmesan cheese and found myself in an enclosed semicircular space surrounded by an aquarium filled with fish of the most dazzling colors, dipping and weaving incessantly between crimson corals. The effect was of a moving wall of color. Hanging from the ceiling, from hooks, were the skeletons of two huge fish, encrusted with barnacles and seaweed. I paused to catch my breath. I've been told to stop here, so I will.
Awesome. Thanks so much. I really like how I guess the smells kind of started as meek and frightened, but then they can somehow reach out and grab you and be threatening. I thought that was really interesting.
Thanks.
I think
So-
that I think that kind of falls into our first question, which is, why did you choose to name your book Smell? Like, why of all the five senses did you decide to fixate on smell?
That's a difficult one. I mean, because, there's many reasons, one can think of reasons that go back to childhood, and then there can be reasons which were more recent. But there two, I think when I think it's changed now with the food revolution. These things are not so, when I was reading it, I was just thinking that actually a lot of people, we don't talk about smell, scent, the smells of food, etc. a lot more now. And it's in newspapers, it's everywhere. But when I was in Paris, I remember, and when I was writing this at 26, so I was in Paris at 19, it was 1990, 91. And at that time, really, it was, nobody spoke about smell. It was considered impolite, it was rude, to talk about such things. And the idea was to have no odor, the concept of having an odor of any kind, whether it was for fruit or vegetables or well, in France, in the farmers' markets, it was always different. You always had a certain smell, but it was in terms of actually spices and cooking and stuff, no. It was not it. It was more butter and cream and those kind of things. So when I was there, the whole idea of smell was something that was simply not talked about. So I think that kind of is something that I found interesting, that this is such an important part of the way one sees the world, and yet it's not spoken about. And I think it's kind of fun to write about something that is not spoken about, because then you don't necessarily have the words for it. So you have to kind of make up the words. So that's a challenge as well, to find the right words, right? I mean, I think that's kind of part of the fun of writing, which is trying to find the right words to express what you want to say. And so this idea was there. And then also, I think the whole idea of invisibility, is something very important to me, because every time I've been a stranger in a new place, I've been to many new places now, but I still remember the first time, which was actually in the US, because I came to study in the US. I got a scholarship and I came. And I remember, that first shock of being in an alien culture. I felt like I became invisible immediately, instantly. My skin color was wrong, my size was wrong, my shape was wrong. Everything just felt wrong. It was very weird. And I just felt quite invisible. So I think all these things went into it. And then another weird thing that happened, which I think must have been there in my mind, happened to me when I was 8 years old and I was living in England, because my dad had to flee the country. He was a journalist. And so he went to England. And then after a few months, I joined him. And I was studying in a little school in Oxford. And I remember on the second day, these girls basically came up to me and said, "Oh, you smell bad." It was just very clear, that it was because I was Indian. And that was the first time that I even felt different or Indian or anything. It was immediately for me related to smell, and it felt like something that I could not control. So I think those things just, remain there and sort of come up when you least expect it. You don't know what affects you, right? So that's why.
So I understand that the protagonist Leela often is in these intense situations of powerlessness, whether it's like experiencing racism or abusive relationships. But I guess she discovers her one power, it seems to be throughout the novel, is her sexuality. Were you trying to reject traditional Indian expectations for women, I guess, when writing about Leela's coming of age in Paris?
Not really. I mean, that kind of happened by accident, actually, because the real thing is that I got interested in the whole idea of smell because it was something invisible. And also because I realized suddenly that it was really an immensely symbolic, because you cannot put a frontier and a border on a smell. And at the same time, smells have been, you say, if you want to define otherness, you say, oh, that person smells, oh, that immigrant population, oh, they smell of garlic, oh, they smell bad, they smell so strong, oh, can't bear to be around them, they stink. So that sense, it was really that feeling of, and at the same time, so I was really looking, and I didn't want to write about myself. I didn't want to make this an autobiographical novel. It's not. I mean, I never thought of myself. I went back to India after I finished college. I was not an immigrant. I didn't grow up feeling like a minority either. I grew up feeling like a majority in the country and like bog standard, basically. I was really but I did know when I was in Paris, because I was helping her fill out papers, a Sri Lankan refugee girl. And I used to help her and her family fill out their papers for the French ID cards. And it was all very complicated. And I even tried to help them because they were being exploited actually by the Tamil tigers, the Sri Lankan Tamil tigers. And so kind of all of that made me, and she was very interesting because she had, the reason that I think was drawn to her was because she had this really strong sensuality. and sexuality, and was kind of very it's horrible to say sort of animal in her sexuality, but there was something so natural about it and about the way she was, and it was so the exact opposite of me, who was I think really, as they say in French, quite coincé and very sort of self-conscious, and so I was very drawn to that. It was, so I think the sexuality thing came in afterwards, but also I think it's because when you go to another country, what I also was aware of was the strength of this girl, and I've seen, and of other people who I've met who were immigrants, and I saw just, my own experience of going to another country and starting off by feeling powerless, but then also discovering aspects of yourself which you would never discover. Like Leela discovers her sense of smell because she's put into another situation. If she remained with her family in Nairobi or maybe gone to London, I don't think she would have discovered it.
For the
Yeah.
next question. Your book Smell is dedicated, quote, to Souls Without Borders, and we were wondering, what does this exactly mean?
Well, I mean, it refers to the fact that, you can't stop, smell cannot be stopped by a border, and souls also being invisible, we can debate whether we have them. I kind of like to think we do. Are also things that cannot be stopped by borders. And then also, I think it was me, I've always thought about death a lot because I lost my mom when I was very young. So I've kind of always felt like she was this presence that sort of has been around me, in invisible something. So I think it was kind of a reference to all that.
Okay, thank you. And I guess our next question is, given the wide range of settings in your novel, and your novels plural actually, from India to Paris to Tokyo, I'm wondering, how do you think about place and its effect on character or plot?
Well, I mean, I would say, place is crucial. It's kind of gives you your, how do I say it? It gives you the structure to your character and plot. It's super, if a writer has a good sense of place, and sometimes when I'm reading my stuff, I'm just like, God, I should have described the place more, because I could have just, by describing, explained so many things. When I reread stuff which I've written, I think, why didn't I do it that way, by describing the place more? Because I think, yeah, I mean, that those are your limits. Those are your, in a sense, the frontiers of the world you create. So in that sense, place is super important. And for me, I've changed places. I've lived in several different countries, and so also every time you go into a new country, a new place, you're struck by it. You're fresh to it as well. So it really sort of it hits you, and then I think places get inside you and then become a part of you in strange ways too. So I think our borders are very porous with places. And
so, excuse me. You've written short stories as well as novels. Could you talk about the form and which one you prefer and why, if you prefer one?
Well, I wrote long short stories. They weren't they weren't that short. They were more like, some were almost novella length. Others were, I think there was just one which I would say is kind of a more traditional short story length, but they're not the kind of short stories that you can get into a magazine, actually. So I think short stories, I decided to write my book of short stories because after I wrote the novel, I was exhausted. And then I wasn't really sure whether I wanted to be a novelist. Because I saw that, it's a lot of art. It's a rather ungrateful, miserable kind of existence, because you spend so much time on your own. And I like being with people. I mean, for me, the novel was about relating. I mean, reading for me is about being with people, because that, in a sense, you're with the people in your story. And even writing was a way for me of discovering people that I didn't know at all. So it's just I don't know how to say it. It's I'm having a break in my train of thought. Remind me of the question again, because I can't remember where I wanted to end up with this.
Which form, whether it's a short story or novel?
Yeah, so that's why I wrote the short stories, to try to get into a whole larger cast of people. And that's when I realized that short stories are really very difficult to write. Because, and it's a completely different form. I mean, it's a completely different exercise. It really is, because you don't have the backstories. Everything has to be conveyed. So in a sense that when you do a short story, I think the place becomes, and the setting really has to say a lot, has to say it all in a way, almost. So it's a very, very different thing. I love reading short stories, I have to say. I mean, I'm crazy about Borges, and I love Alice Munro. And so I really think short stories are underexploited, and weirdly, publishers are very against short stories for some reason. They're like, no, give us a novel, give us a novel. Whereas I think in today's world, with your time so broken up, it's a short story is great. It's you get into a moment in a way. It's like the grain of sand in which you see the universe. But I think it requires a bit more concentration than being able to just kind of sink into a story and just go with the flow.
For sure. Yeah. It's also, you don't have nearly as much time for your beautiful or vivid descriptions of smell and place and exposition, right? You don't have any time to spend describing your surroundings as much.
True. You have to be very much to the point, but it's a great exercise because you really learn. I think that editing is a real skill. It's a really, really tough. I find I have a really hard time editing myself. And since you're old, I suspect many of you are budding writers. I'm sure you're struggling with these things too. And it's a completely other skill. But doing the short stories forced me to think about structure. What is structure? What does structure mean? And then it also forced me to really think about what is necessary, what is not necessary, which then is very useful for editing. And then really kind of get to the essence of a character. How do you describe a character without actually saying so-and-so was like this and like that,
So I guess our next question is, along with being a writer, you also studied Odissi, or Indian classical dancing.
That's
I guess there's what leads you to, and there's also a scene in Smell in which Leela dances, that's really moving. What leads you to, I guess, move between these forms of expression? And do you think how do you think dancing maybe influences your writing?
Well, I think dancing is really crucial, whether it's you're a man or a woman or a boy or a girl or a child. I think human beings really need to be dancing more. We all need to dance more because it's a way of expressing our sensuality. And really in our life where we're getting more and more intellectual and in the head, one is really losing that connection to one's body. And I just got into dance because my mother was a dancer. And I mean, I like moving. I love to move. I like being able to forget my head. It's not easy. My head tends to yak away and dominate my life. And I love being able, the few times when I'm really able to switch off that voice and switch it off is either when I'm dancing or more recently playing tennis, but tennis is also like a dance. So it's really having that moment, having those times when you can switch off that voice. That's when you completely recharge, when you connect with something much, much larger. When that voice is going on, you know that you're in your mind, and your mind is not all of who you are. And I just did it because I luckily just followed my mother. I wanted to be closer to my mother because I lost her when I was 3. And so and she was passionate about dance. She was an Odissi dancer. So I just kind of did it because it was my way of somehow being close to her. But then I fell in love with it. And then it's also a great way of telling a story because Indian classical dance is about telling a story. but also through the emotions. It's very much, it's quite very much related to narrative, but it's the same. You have an idea, you have kind of a philosophical idea, and you give it expression through a narrative, which I think is kind of my approach also with the writing. Anything else?
Yes.
Next question, I guess.
Anaka,
Yeah, can you talk about your work for the Rajiv Gandhi Foundation?
Oh yeah, that well, again, I think, I just I mean, I wanted to do, I studied anthropology, so I was really interested in social change and not at all interested in writing. And so really my thing was that after I finished with Amherst, I just went back. I worked a while in the UN, and then I did an internship, and then that became a job. But then I decided not to stay there because I really felt it was not grassroots enough, and it was still too much in my head. And so I went back to India, and I was looking for a job in the development field, and I was sort of lost. And I went to a conference, and it was actually, this is going to sound very stupid, but I was actually asking where the restroom was. And it just turned out that the person I was asking about this happened to recognize me from something. He had met me a long time ago when I was a kid, and he said, "Aren't you so-and-so's daughter?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Oh, so what do you do?" and all that. And I said, "Well, I'm here and I'm looking for a job. And I came to this conference because I'm really interested in social development." It was one of these big public conference halls. And that's why I'm here. And I thought that, this would be a good place to start to get into the scene. And he said, "Oh, really? What kind of job are you looking for?" And that's kind of what happened. He says, "Well, I know this organization, which is looking for somebody in the who to start a project in terrorist and violence areas." And I thought, wow, that sounds amazing, because it'll be exciting. I'll be going out of the city. I'll be going to areas which are backward, which are not connected well with the city. I'll be seeing people who are very, very different from the kind of people you meet in the city. And that's just what I wanted. I wanted to experience life as much as I could. I wanted to, kind of like drink in people who were as different from me as possible. And I mean, I think that's really because of the books I was sort of reading, my steady diet of always reading things which were about different places. And that's how it happened. It was just that. And then I did the job because I thought it would be an adventure. I was 24, and I wanted to have adventures. I wanted to do something different. And if I could make a difference to somebody's life. And so I went to these areas, and they were so, I mean, when you go into an area like that, which is torn apart by violence, it's really weird because there's no such thing as community. Communities are destroyed by violence. The moment there's violence in an area, then there is no the community disappears, and everybody becomes atomized and becomes very different. So then trying to find these children was a real task, and I had to really work. I had to go there. I went there. I used the police records. I used to go to the police stations and photocopy their records, and then try to look up those families and see and find them. And then slowly, as the word spread, it got easier. But nobody had ever done a project like this, so it was in the beginning quite tough and stressful, but fun, always fun.
Awesome. And I guess we're approaching our Q&A session, but we do have a couple more questions we want to ask you. I guess mainly, what difficulties do you face as a writer? How do you overcome them? And then maybe you could use that to maybe tell us what advice you would give to us, to emerging young writers.
Well, I'm going to start with the last one, because I have to tell you that I have no advice to give, because it's tough being a writer. And I think the most difficult thing is, of course, dealing with, that fear of the blank page, and were looking at that and thinking your work is not good enough and thinking you are not good enough. So, one constantly struggles with these issues of self-worth and thinking someone else's work is better than mine, and mine is not good enough. And then also, as you work on something long enough, you start feeling that your story has to be the most tired, mundane, and banal thing that exists in the universe, whereas everybody else's story feels wonderfully fresh and interesting and exciting. So it's not easy, huh? But I think it's a very, it's something you have to struggle a lot, not just financially. You have to struggle emotionally, especially. I would say it's like a real emotional struggle to do it long term. I'm not talking. I think your first book is tough, but in a way, it's the easiest of the things you're going to write. But on the other hand, it's really wonderful because it's a way of empathizing with the world and of being a part of the world. And I think if you're a writer, I think you always have this rather ambiguous relationship of wanting to be in the world, be a part of the world, and at the same time be an observer as well. You're always dealing with the question of your own difference vis-a-vis others, and kind of, I'm also always dealing with the fact that people are an eternal mystery, and I don't really always understand why people do what they do. So all these things are kind of fun things to think about. But it's if you write and if you try to have a family like I have, it's really tough.
Thank you.
I think.
Oh,
Yeah,
sorry. No, still going.
Sorry. Connection is a real problem when you're a writer. With how to connect it. Which points do you connect? I have a writer friend who says, okay, you can do family and writing, or you can do friends and writing, but you can't do family, friends, and writing. It's a very sad, grim kind of thing to think about. So I sometimes do the family and writing, and sometimes I do the friends and writing. But you're always frustrated.
Thank you. I think this will probably be our last question before we turn to the audience. But you mentioned how your first book would be your easiest, but also your hardest. Can you describe your evolution as a novelist over time?
Oh wow, I don't I don't I don't know if I can answer this one. Because I mean, for me, each book began with a question that I wanted to answer, and something that kind of marked me. So like Lanterns on Their Horns, I was really very interested in what made a cow sacred. But it was also kind of looking at modernity and tradition, and kind of turning the whole idea of modernity, that tradition has to give way to modernity. And what if I decided to just flip it and say, well, what if tradition exists within modernity, and actually you can have great modernity within tradition, and that they're not discontinuous, and they are actually things that are all happening at the same time, in the same space. So that was sort of each book has been really about some kind of like a paradox that I sense, which is interesting to me. And then the one that was set in Japan, again, I kind of went back to the invisibility theme, because I think that is something I'm very interested in. But also was about addiction. It's really a study of addiction, and what is addiction, because I think we are all kind of prone to being addicted to something or the other. And it's just a question of when that switch gets flipped, and what is the object that you fixate on. I know that now, of course, I'm sure that if I went and saw a psychoanalyst, they'd probably say, oh, you're very OCD and that's your fixation problem and stuff. But luckily, I never went to anybody. And so I just kind of try to work out all these things just through the stories.
Okay. Thanks so much for, I guess, having us interview you, or allowing us to interview you. We're now gonna, I guess, over
Thanks.
to.
Nice to meet you. I'm sorry I'm not there in person.
Yeah,
because it's much more fun.
this is, I guess it's one nice thing about the pandemic and Zoom is we can interview people across the country, right?
Yeah.
We have people from, I guess, all over. New
Wow.
York, New Jersey, Poland, Germany.
Wow.
Yeah. So I guess to the audience, if you have any questions that came up during the interview or you would like to ask, I guess feel free to either unmute yourself and ask them directly. You can also type them into the Zoom chat.
Oh, let me get to the chat then.
I guess I've got a question, which is like when you find yourself writing, like generally, do you find yourself writing like in like smaller chunks, like in like the in-between times, or like is the main way you write like you just like sit down and you go like, I am going to do this for hours at a time?
Well, I would love to be able to do it for hours at a time. And I always lose track of time. And then usually kids come home and husband comes home and they're like, where's the food? And I'm like, oh, so sorry. Let's have eggs tonight kind of thing. But no, unfortunately, I used to have much larger chunks of time with the first book. And I think that's why I feel like that was the easier one. And then since then, it's just been chunks of time, and it both have pluses and minuses. It's great to have that sense of freedom and that feeling of emptiness in your head, which a large chunk of time gives you. And definitely when you don't have kids and when you don't have family and when you don't have other things, and when you don't have homework, which is, I suspect, your big problem, all of you. I know it's crazy how much homework you get in the US. It's nuts. I mean, my kids are constantly complaining about that. It's tough, but yeah, I mean, the in-between times are great because actually then you come back to it and you see it from a different perspective. So you can, I'm now very much, unfortunately, an in-between writer. But then when I do start writing, I try to, because it takes me a few days to get back into it, of course, sometimes even a couple of weeks, then I try to at least make sure that I can do it for about a couple of weeks at a stretch every day, even if it's half an hour or something. I just do it. You know, I even if I'm not writing, if I'm just sort of thinking, it's fine.
So another question AJ asked was, I guess, what are some common mistakes young writers make?
I think one is writing autobiographically, because then when you step out of autobiography, you know, it's because you feel nervous and you think, oh, well, if I talk about myself, I have an interesting story, I'll tell it. But the problem is that the next step becomes harder if you want to carry on, because especially if you're successful talking about yourself, then it gets much more difficult to then step out of yourself, I think, you know, to kind of push the boundaries of your imagination without the help of your own personal stories and personal feelings. That's challenging. But it's definitely worth doing. In a way, when you write about others, you actually do also come back to yourself. But you often come back to yourself in a nice way because you start seeing yourself in a different perspective also. So I would say that's one thing. And then the other very common mistake is when you're young is to think that I have to write something that's going to be catchy. And I'm talking about my own book. I mean, I'm reading it and now after like God knows how many years. I started in 1996, this one, and I finished in 1999. So long time ago. So I mean, I read it now and yeah, I mean, some bits I can see, you know, I was good because I was just really in the story and I really didn't care about what it sounded like. I was just writing. But then the other bits I can see suddenly I become self-conscious. And there's a sentence which is there because it's a pretty sentence. And I would definitely try to avoid that. Huh?
I have a quick question. Oh, sorry. Well, first of all, I really enjoyed listening to your talk. I found myself really being in shock. I feel like I have much in common with you. I'm also an anthropologist. I went to a school about an hour away from Amherst, another liberal arts school, which you've probably heard of. I'm an Indian classical dancer and I play tennis as well. So I was very excited to hear about a little bit about your background. But My question is I think that, we know through social science research that our senses, physical senses, have a complex relationship with socioeconomics. And for example, loudness or sound is often connected with lower socioeconomic statuses and communities, while silence is, affiliated with, higher socioeconomic status. And I think smell in Western popular cultural or thought or imagination kind of has a similar relationship. Whereas we think of the other, like you mentioned before, the Eastern cultures as having potent, poignant smells, and the West being kind of smell, or having a lack of smell, one might say. And so, I wanted your opinion. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, controlling the smell, being more in control also.
Absolutely. And so I wanted your opinion on whether you think moving forward, will we, kind of settle into our ideological silos and further continue to think this way? Or do you think that, as you mentioned, are more connected through technology, et cetera, through various means of meeting new people, meeting others, do you think that this tendency will reduce?
Well, I mean, I'm a great believer in meeting others. I think that definitely is the best way to have these tendencies reduce. But I do kind of worry that actually with the amount of time that we do spend on the internet and looking at our phones, like just a small example, before, when you didn't have a phone and you were standing in a line, I know people used to talk to each other a lot more. Now everybody's just looking at their phone. And it's rare the times. I love the times when I have, I'm sitting on the court waiting for my turn on the tennis court or something, and I'm waiting, and so, I start having a chat with somebody next to me. It's fantastic, but those moments seem to be getting less. So it's good to, not be shy and kind of just get out there. But yeah, I do kind of, the phone thing really, everyone is just in their phone. And it's a wonderful way of not engaging with others, actually. And then it becomes a kind of a thing where you almost feel uncool if you're the only one looking around with big eyes at everybody, staring at them. And so, yeah, silo thinking with the internet is a serious problem. And the kind of unexpectedness of conversation and encounters, the fact that you learn things that you wouldn't otherwise learn. I worry that those moments of having something unexpected happen is going down sharply.
Thank you so much.
If I may ask, because you talked about, I kind of noticed, and I was wondering, because a lot of the things in your writing and even in the things you talk about in your life seem like even the motive of the book, which is smell, and the whole text was very sensory, not just smell, but there were colors and feelings. But there's this feeling that you are drawn to like a sudden thrusted upon the reader imaginary that is kind of like, even when you talk about dance, that is something momentary, or even the unexpectedness of conversation. This is something that happens, the turns of conversations are like fast and unexpected, and what draws you to those momentary experiences in writing, when novel is usually this long, it's obviously a long form, but the experiences in a novel are also often prolonged in a lot of those. So what draws you to those momentary experiences? Sorry if I ramble.
No,
I'm Polish, so English is my second language. So
well, you're doing beautifully. Your English is fantastic. So my best friend when I was in Amherst was Polish, and her English was much better than mine. She wrote beautifully. But no, I understand your question, and it's also a question of the book, because in this book, since I was writing about a young person, and I think when you're young, you live much more in the moment. And, each moment hits you so much more powerfully. Whereas as you get older, like my state now, you see time seems to stretch. You see the duration, you see the past, and you see the future, and you see where you are, and you see there's a kind of a flow. You see the flow more clearly than the moment. Moment sometimes is I think it's dull. The moments when I feel surprised are so much fewer now. So it's partly that it's a young person's book. It's written by a young person, and it's written about a young person. And if I'm writing about a young person, even if I was writing now, I'd still end up adopting that voice, because as you get more into that person, into a young person's psyche, you will experience things more sort of intensely and not emotionally, but I think, yeah, in the instant, as you pointed out, which is very correct. I wrote my last book, which hopefully will come out this coming year, is actually about a man, an architect, a Japanese architect in his 40s, and it's very different, and the sense of time there is very, very different.
Thank you so much.
There were some questions on the chat. Do I have to answer those?
Let's look at Kate's question. So this is also really interesting. What kind of writing would you like to see assigned in school, if any?
Oh, I mean, I've got, this is a very sort of, I'm totally biased, but I would actually like to see more writing that is experiential, where you challenge, I would like, one thing I would like to do, if ever anybody asked me, is I would like to play that lovely silly party game where you pick out a word, and then you have to make a sentence with it, and then someone has to add to that sentence, and then you kind of create a story together and play. I know it sounds silly, but I love the idea of playing with words, playing with games, and playing together and writing. I think those kind of things are, and creating, because that's when you learn, what is a writing class? What should it look like? I think it should be about exploring and playing with words, not trying to sit down and worry too much. Read for pleasure, read, and play with words and explore, and sure, read, and then maybe get somebody to come and talk about how they enjoyed the book, how they read the book. That would be, for me, fine. But really, to have the reading and then have it more oral, rather than having someone write a question and ask you some dumb question just so that you can show that you're so intellectual and that you really analyze the character nicely. Because honestly, I think when you're writing, you get carried away in the skin of your person, right? You don't analyze that person. That's for someone else to do, really. Someone else to draw those conclusions. And I don't know, I don't know if I think when you're in school, it would be much more fun to make sure that reading is associated with pleasure and fun and laughter. I would love to do things like, take people out and just say, okay, describe a color. Write about any color that you can, but write about it as if the color was a person. Set those kind of challenges and do those kind of things. It would be much, much more fun. And you'd learn I think you'd learn more about writing like that, or just take a bowl of but you take cold water, or if it snows, take the kids outside, make them shove their hand into the snow, keep it there, count to 10, take it out and write about that, describe it. Stuff like that. I mean, these are silly things, but maybe more activity oriented rather than having to read a book and then analyze it. Better read the book and just discuss it in class, and then go on to writing something. You're right in the voice of one of the characters, maybe, that kind of thing. But to me, that would be way more fun.
Yeah, awesome. We will have opportunities, I guess, hopefully somewhat like that in our writing exercises towards the end of our session.
Yeah, okay, yeah, just take a color. It's fun. Write about a smell that is, like Proust's Madeleine, right? Isn't that interesting? I mean, yeah, how the whole, that in a way, the passage that everybody remembers when they think of Proust is about smell.
Okay, so I guess we want to thank you so much for joining us. This was a really fun interview.
Yes, thank
I
you.
have so many ideas about writing and what I'm going to try.
I hope there are no teachers are in on this, because I think I'll get killed.
Yeah, so I guess, yeah, thanks for coming. I guess everyone give a round of applause in the Zoom chat, in the reactions. Yeah.
Well, thank you, and read the other books. And keep writing, just keep writing, and don't take all your school literature papers too seriously, whatever you do.
I like
And
that.
and don't, and if you're going to do, if you're doing your sort of, I don't know, if any of you are in IB schools, don't try to avoid doing high level English. If you want to be a writer, I think just read a lot for yourself.
Wonderful. Okay, so.
And go out and have experiences, meet strange people, put yourself out there, challenge yourself.
Awesome.
And rest. I look forward to reading all of you.
Yeah. And also if you want to, I guess, stay on and join us, our next interview, we're going to be interviewing Philip Gourevitch. Towards the end of the session, if you want to participate in our writing exercises, that would be great as well.
Well, the thing is, I have a language class which is going to start sometime. I'm trying to think when it's going to start. I could stay for a little bit and listen. I'd love to listen, but then I'd probably have to sort of just disappear.
Sure.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So I guess we're going to transition now.
I will mute myself so I don't disturb you.
Sure. So we're going to transition now, I guess, towards our next interview with Philip Gourevitch. I'm going to introduce him shortly, and I guess we're going to skip the excerpt for time, but I guess I'll introduce him, and then after I introduce him, we're going to welcome him to give a short, I guess, a brief comment on, I guess, the importance of reading and writing to him personally, and how he understands reading and writing as important to high school students and everyone, really. So here's a short introduction. Philip Gourevitch first began his literary career publishing short fiction essays in literary magazines before turning to journalism. And Mr. Gourevitch has been a regular contributor to The New Yorker since 1995 and a staff writer there since 1997. He has traveled extensively for the magazine, reporting from Africa, Asia, and Europe. And his articles in The New Yorker have been finalists for the National Magazine Award. From 2005 to 2010, Gourevitch served as editor of the Paris Review. He is the author of the books The Ballad of Abu Ghraib, A Cold Case, and his first book on Rwanda is called We Wish to Inform You That Tomorrow We Will Be Killed with Our Families. And his books, articles, and short stories have been translated into more than a dozen languages. He now lives in Brooklyn with his wife and daughter, publishing articles periodically in The New Yorker. And his most recent book, a follow-up to his first book of a reportage on the Rwandan genocide, is titled You Hide That You Hate Me and I Hide That I Know. So now we want to welcome Philip Gourevitch to, I guess, tell us a little bit about what reading and writing means to him. Everyone, round of applause, Zoom chat, reaction.
What writing and reading mean to me. Thank you for the introduction. Thanks for having me here. I should just, I'm just going to say my name's pronounced Gourevitch. I should have sent that in so you knew, but just for the record. And what writing and reading mean to me, it's kind of hard to describe that as separate from life itself. I mean, at this point, I've been doing it for a long time. I think reading comes first, and I'm sometimes surprised when I meet people who want to be writers or say they want to be writers, or even some who are writers who don't seem to read that much. I'm a little baffled by it. You don't meet young musicians who don't listen to music much, or who don't imitate it also, straight up. I mean, if somebody wants to learn to be a guitarist, many of them never can. I mean, some of the great musicians can't read music, but they spend all their time listening to it, studying it, figuring out how somebody else did it, working at it, doing it like 5, 10, 12 hours a day by themselves or with buddies. And I think that's in some ways what writing and reading are like for somebody who's for whom it resonates that way, and for whom it becomes a kind of way of life. You do go out into the world, obviously, a great deal as a writer, and especially doing the kind of reporting I'm doing, but you're going out as a writer. You're not simply, it's different from the kind of experience that you have if you it's the way that you process experience is different if you sort of have the general idea that you are going to approach it because you're writing about it. It gives you a framework for experiencing things. It gives you a way for kind of constructing and extracting meaning from things, for observing, for noticing. I often think it's a way of slowing down time and not losing things. If you write things down, even if all you do is keep a sort of straightforward journal of your thoughts and your observations and your encounters in life, you will have a better sense of those experiences. Obviously, you can distort them by writing them down. All representation is distortion. And that's kind of one of the interesting problems of writing, is that you often write in order to see more clearly, but in the process you impose various filters that you may or may not even be aware of that make it harder to see as clearly, or make you see your way. Which can be the most interesting thing from a writer, is seeing how they write their own way. So for me, that the reading and the writing are totally inextricable in a sense. And I think when one is starting out, one of the difficulties is that can make you feel like you're imitating, or you're worried about imitating, or you're not quite sure where the various things that have influenced and excited you and inspired you to become, or to try to be a writer, or to be writing, never mind being a writer, just to be writing, you sort of wonder, well, I'm aware of how that sounds like this. I'm aware of how that sounds like that. What's my voice? That's a lot of what people often take time to find. And that's where the apprenticeship is. It's probably why, of all the arts, there aren't a ton of child prodigies who are writers. There are performers and musicians and visual artists sometimes who are, real masters at your, high school age or before. There are very few writers who've ever really done anything very enduring that way at a young age. It takes a while to, it's also the only art form or form of expression that uses entirely something we do all the time, which is to string words together to communicate. We all are using language all the time, but it's a different relationship to language. It's some people write very differently than they speak. Some people make a great effort to write like they speak. Some people can't help but write like they speak. But you're using this kind of material of day-to-day life, that you use anyway, language, and you're investing it with something else. It has a life to you. That's what reading and writing is. The words and language have lives and shapes that convey meaning in different arrangements. I mean, that's literally what it is. And then as was mentioned in the introduction, I started out mostly thinking writing meant writing fiction. I still to this day read far more novels than I do nonfiction books. Although I mostly write nonfiction and admire a good deal of nonfiction writing. But I found that, especially like in my 20s, when I would hole up in a room for weeks, months, whatever, I had part-time jobs and would just kind of hand-to-mouth existence, I would be writing a lot, but I kind of felt like the more I got into things, the less I was connected to the world. I was trying to invent a world I hadn't spent enough time in, alone at my desk. And when I stumbled into reporting, which I really did stumble into, I didn't think like I must become a reporter or I have to get out there. And it just suddenly felt like, what a gift. I get to go out, ask impertinent questions, stick myself into the middle of action, watch people in a bunch of different ways interacting with each other, encounter real villains and people in, all kinds of contexts, and see how things work. And it's a different activity. Reporting is a whole other set of skills and muscles and habits and instincts, learning how to talk to people, learning how to figure out what you're seeing when you're seeing it, which can be quite confusing, learning how, if you're reading a story about what you're seeing, if something is literally in the news, or you're usually, by the time that you go to do something, you have some idea about it, being able to see what's actually there versus your idea that was in your head when you arrived, or that you've read about it before. And there's some people who are really good reporters who really can't write. That's sort of, you've seen them in the old movies and things, the ones who call in on the phone and say, like, honey, get me rewrite. And they basically dictate a story over the phone as a bunch of facts. They're scoop reporters or so. They're really good nonfiction writers who can't really report. They're somewhere between essayists, memoirists, but they're not really either interested in or given to or, sort of digging into things. And to me, I happen to like and have discovered that I have some facility for doing both. And so my life now consists to a large extent of going between the two. There'll be periods where I'm writing, but writing much less because I'm gathering material and kind of just digesting it and creating, in a sense, what I think of sometimes as footage. Like if you were a documentary maker or a filmmaker, you'd be on the set and then you go to the editing room and you make the thing. You're going to have a vast amount of material. I can't get my arms far enough apart on a Zoom frame, but vast amounts of material that you're going to try and fit into this amount of space. And so it's all about that shaping it, and that's where you come in as a writer, which is taking material and sort of creating your version and account of it that you think is both true to what's out there and works as writing.
Okay, thanks so much. You mentioned your experience kind of accidentally kind of finding reporting, and I guess the joy of asking impertinent questions. It's really, having read your first book on the Rwandan genocide, it was really remarkable to see you get so many different people to talk to you, especially not just people from various walks of life who had different experiences with the genocide, but also major actors in the mass killings. How do you persuade people to talk to you?
You call them up or you go to them. I mean, it is a very odd aspect of what we do, but I don't really push people to talk to me. There are very few times that I will pursue somebody who really does not want to talk. And they usually, the only person I would pursue who doesn't want to talk is somebody who has something really obvious to answer for. So usually somebody who in the story I'm working on is either a public figure, and usually a public figure who's on the defensive for a good reason. So then you're sort of like, look, you've got yourself into, whether it's a politician who's trying to avoid questions, or whether it's somebody who's accused of killing in Rwanda, or of being assisting killers, or knowing things that they're trying to hide from you, then that's a sort of and they have a public role. But there are also a lot of people who I talk to who are not public figures in any way, right? They're essentially, they have a big story that intersects with or is part of a big public historical story, but they themselves are not in any way, the rest of their life does not consist in dealing with or talking to the press or the public, even in their little community maybe. So for the most part, if they don't want to talk to me, I'm not going to get them to talk to me, very interestingly. You can't, I wrote a book about Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, where there was this American torture story. And the fact is, one of the things that made total sense to me is that torturing people is not a good way to get information out of them. Confessions and information and anything that you get by putting pressure in the wrong way, the best way to get information out of people, even in a hostile situation, is in a non-hostile fashion. You know, it's like, okay, here we are in this situation, let's talk. And what I found in Rwanda was that, well, I'm a stranger, I'm an outsider. That's both an advantage and a disadvantage. The advantage is it's not totally clear where they can't immediately fit me into it, right? I'm not part of the story to them. The disadvantage, obviously, I don't know the language. I don't know a lot of the context that they have in their minds, and they have any reason to be suspicious and not know what to make of me, and it's why bother? On the other hand, I was going in, and people like to talk. I mean, the basic thing is, and this is true everywhere, people like to talk, even when it's kind of hard to imagine what's in their interest about it. And even when they're somewhat so-called media savvy or have an idea of, you know, the press, people tend to think their story makes sense. They feel they haven't been understood, they haven't been heard. And in Rwanda, a lot of people felt they hadn't been heard. They felt they or wouldn't be heard, or they wanted to talk about people that what they'd been through. And they were, one of the most important things to them, though, was that you were not just dropping by to kind of cherry pick their story. And so it's important I found it's important when I talk to people in difficult situations, I try not to supply emotion. I think that's very, like, I've noticed other people, especially in TV journalism, they're often trying to like ring, you know, if they can get somebody to cry on camera, fantastic for them, it's good TV. And it's just totally not my feeling. It almost sounds bad in writing when you have to say, like, then they started crying. You know, sometimes they do, but you have to establish that this is not what you were going for. You know, or they, you know, strong emotion. What I want is for them to think they can talk to me without having to worry about what that's like for me. And the other thing you want them to know is that you actually are interested, that you don't have, you're not trying to slot them into some idea you have. So I often play much more ignorant than I am when I first meet people. I act like I'm not quite sure why I was introduced to them, or, you know, I just came by and I don't know anything about what's going on around here. I heard such and such, but I'm not sure. And then you slowly slide into like, yeah, I knew a little more about that. Yeah, well, I talked to so-and-so also. And they start to see that you actually know what you're talking about, but by then they're in the conversation. And that may not be, again, it may not be adversarial. It may be somebody that you're going to with a lot of sympathetic view, like you've heard that they were, you know, had troubles, but that you want to hear about their troubles, but you don't want to go in there and say, here's how I understand what happened to you. Is that true? You want to go in and sort of say, what happened to you? Or what's going on around here? What, you know, and the other thing that I would just say that's very important, and this is true whether you're reporting in the aftermath of a war or in a crime, or if you're interviewing somebody for a profile who's like an artist, you know, in New York, and there's nothing adversarial, there's no crisis, there's just like, it's almost like part of their public life is doing this. Going back more than once, if you ever can, is always good, because the first time is the first time. People don't really know you. They're not really sure what they think of doing it. And like conversations or like reading a book, the period of time between, like if you're reading a book and you read a chapter and you put it down and then you come back the next day, the book's been with you in the meantime. You've been in conversation with that book to some extent, you know, even quite unconsciously, especially if it's a good book that you're engrossed in, right? You return to it. It's the same with, you know, TV series. It's the same with conversations with, it's what a friendship is based on, is like you're picking up where you left off or where you catch up next, but it's this ongoing encounter that deepens between sessions in spite of nothing happening, because they're also processing it in their mind. And for them, it's probably a bigger deal. Your job is to go around talking to people all day. They're going about their lives, and suddenly this person has come along whom they're a little bit unsure about. And then they start thinking about the conversation. They think of things they wish they'd said, things they might have wanted to clarify, things that, now that we're talking about this, you should probably also know this. And so if somebody starts to take shape in your mind as somebody that you're really interested in as a, when you're writing and you're interviewing, going back repeatedly. I've broken off conversations before I had to leave because I thought, this is really good. I'm totally engrossed, but I kind of want to pick this up again later and see and have them know. And then they also think, people would often say to me things like this when I've gone back to people. They'll say, well, you know how things are around here, or you're quite, you've been here, you've been around, you've seen other people. I know that you talk to so and so. They start to get used to you. They get comfortable with you. They also see it's different if you're doing daily reporting, which I don't do, because then people are much more concerned about what's going to be in the paper tomorrow. But when they sort of don't really see anything from you right away, but they kind of get used to your presence and they don't think you have an agenda, that makes a big difference. So a lot of it's just the same as being with people. I don't go in with extensive notes. You always want to be responding to what they say, not to just ask your next question.
Yeah, thank you.
One of the complicated, huh?
Oh, sorry. If you're still going, you go. Oh, okay. Well, almost as a follow-up to the answer, you moved or you traveled to Rwanda for a long time and going back and forth, and you mentioned that a desire to understand the truth in writing, and not many would have the courage to go to travel to like post-war areas, much less to active like combat zones. And what inspired you to actually go and report on the crisis?
I'd been doing some writing about the way that America at that moment had been commemorating the Holocaust, which was like, that was right the same moment, more or less, where you'd had the opening of the museum in Washington and the movie Schindler's List. They'd both been released, and there was a kind of tone in America like, oh, we're way beyond that, and we're teaching tolerance by teaching these horrors, and we would prevent that, and all this never again stuff. And then you had the war in Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, the Bosnia conflict was also simultaneous. And a ton of press was over there. And then this thing happens in the center of Africa that like kind of puts to the test all this rhetoric and all these other ways that we were thinking about it and what our relationship really was to the world and to ideas of common humanity that I'd been thinking about. And I actually went there thinking much more about us, like about America and American foreign policy, and nothing, there'd been very little by the time I went there that really made me understand it. I talked to a couple people who'd been there. It was pretty clear that it wasn't like blowing up, that I wasn't going into an active war zone. There was a lot going on, but for the most part, foreigners weren't threatened. It was like in the hills or in the villages, or it was pretty localized things inside Rwanda by the time I got there. And I wasn't interested in being a combat reporter. There were plenty of them that I've known. And it's interesting, I suppose, and I've come up against the edges of it by doing things that I do. But I was much more interested in those moments of like aftermath where people start to digest and process what they've been through. And so most of my interviews, even if they were about conflict and the last year of troubles or two, they would be like sitting with somebody, on a chair on their backyard. They weren't sort of in the heat of the moment. They were just in that moment where they have enough of a sense of perspective to try to start talking about things. And so I went with this idea that I wanted to kind of write about our relationship to it, like us as Americans, us as this sort of post-Cold War moment. And I immediately thought it's a part of the story, but it's not as interesting to me as the people I'm meeting. And part of that was, again, if you look at other conflicts in the world, big crises, whether it's the Armenian genocide or the Holocaust or the partition in India or you name it, there's kind of a lot of literature on the fact that many people don't talk about it for many years. Even within families, often decades go by before it starts to come out. And in Rwanda, that just wasn't so. It had been very fast and speed was a part of it. And so I had gone expecting that it would be very difficult. This sort of gets back to your earlier question too, very difficult to talk to people. And I was surprised by what superb talkers they were, like how much they wanted to talk, how well they spoke. Not in the sense that I didn't expect them to be articulate, but that they really did kind of had a lot to say about their experience, which sometimes people don't. So that's what drew me to keep going back. I just became completely engrossed. And to me, it was also these huge ultimate questions were all contained in this little place. It's very rare that you go anywhere where everybody's sort of part of your story. Everything you see, everybody you do is kind of thinking about the things you're thinking about in these, even in ultimate and in very practical day-to-day terms. So I felt like totally drawn back to it. That's really what kept me going back. Because there were two huge questions. One, how does something like this happen? And the other, how do you live with it once it's happened? They get entangled because obviously they're in relationship to each other. But the longer question of how you live with it afterwards was one that everybody was having to deal with also. And it's what's kept me going back also. But
you mentioned first arriving in Rwanda, trying to maybe understand the US and foreign policy, and getting kind of sucked into the stories of the people you talk to. You do a wonderful job of, I guess, juggling these, narrating these complex social and political situations. Do you have strategies for narrating these things? Yeah.
I mean, no, I don't. I mean, yeah, of course, you're thinking about it all the time. You sort of, I mean, you want to be as much as you can combining the things that, what interests me? Why am I here? What are the questions I have? Those questions, of course, guide you. Some of those questions emerge as you go, or they get clarified, but sometimes you just find yourself asking them over and over, and they're going to be, the material you get is going to be shaped by them. But a lot of it, you want to be following what emerges. And in terms of writing it, I envy greatly the people who are good outliners. I think they waste less time than I do. I think they, that's a virtue, obviously, but I'm not a good outliner. I have in my mind shapes and ideas of the material. I start to see which stories interest me. Sometimes that occurs, obviously it occurs like right in the moment. You're talking to somebody and you're like, wow, they're filling something out. And part of that is that when you're deeply immersed in a subject, you've talked to a lot of people. Some people you've talked to for an hour, some people you've talked to for 6 hours. And you notice when somebody tells you something you haven't heard, that's differently told or more complete. So that underlying the people that I end up selecting for a story, there often are many other partial voices that have in some way made me aware of or alerted to me the idea that this story speaks for something larger without my ever having to make that claim. Like it's solid. It has, this is the person that can carry the weight of what I'm trying to tell you here. And then you start writing and you start to see every once in a while somebody that you thought was pretty good when you met them. You start writing and you realize what I recorded or what I wrote in my notebook, they don't hang together. There was a lot of charisma there. There were a lot of things they said that when I stopped to think about them, I have more questions, and they're not questions that are going to resolve themselves easily. There's something overly complicated about this person for that part, And so what you thought was going to be promising falls apart in the writing, whereas other people emerge in the writing. I mean, I can give you an example in the story, in this long follow-up I've been working on about this one village in Rwanda. There's a killer and a victim, survivor who I met in 1996, and I kind of followed them for the rest of their lives, which was about in the last 5-6 years. They both died as quite old. And then I was tracking down the killer's kids, one of whom was like 8 when he was during the genocide, and it was very willing to talk to me, but he had a kind of zombie persona, right? Like we met, it was 10 in the morning. He immediately ordered like a liter of beer, and he had this kind of glazed, still, frozen, almost like, a frightened, and he spoke in a complete flat monotone. And I was working with a interpreter who I've worked with for a long time. So I got all the words, but I felt like it was kind of a dead interview by the end. Like it just felt so without any texture or any. And later, when I started to read it over and over and look at it and see if there was anything I could use, I realized it was huge, that he'd said a lot, and that he had said it so flatly, and he had said it so plainly often, about what it was like to be afraid of his father, what it was like afterwards to think of his father both as a monstrous criminal and to say, but he is my father. And my relationship is complicated because he is my father. And he then became this boy who chose within the family to be the boy who carried food to him at the prison every day. So he did this kind of like walk of shame every day through the village, past the other survivors. His family had survivors on his mother's side. And he carrying this like bucket of food to his father in prison. And all of this came out so that suddenly, as I was writing it, it became 10 times better than the interview. The opposite can also happen. So people emerge over time. And especially if you do something over time, it's very hard. Most journalism, most reporting, most writing period is a kind of snapshot. Even novels, even if they have a big scope, they're usually written within a few years. And somebody's thinking like, this is my take on this whole situation. But they don't think, what's my take on this whole family story now and in 5 years, and 5 years from now? And how do the people in that story remember what happened in the early chapters 10 years later? That's not a way people write novels, because it's impossible, right? It's too many layers. But there are kinds of writing where you go back to something over time. And so it's very hard to map that out. So I don't have strategies except to keep putting it down, keep reworking the material and finding its shapes. And obviously chronology is important. I find, keeping things in chronological order is usually useful. And since things don't all happen in chronological order, which is to say there are multiple chronologies in all stories, there's the chronology in which events happen. There's the chronology in which people sort of know what happened or learn about what happened from each other and in other ways. There are all these layers to that, but you try to figure out which chronologies are working for you, because it's very helpful. It helps you put in information for people. And of course, the longer a piece you're writing, the more time you have, once you've got things set up, to let the reader be in the same place they know what's going on, and you can start bringing them into that great experience that you've had of really just seeing the resonances in a story, the exciting moments. That happens in any piece of good fiction or any movie you're watching too, right? There's this period at the beginning where you're just apprehending the details. What's this? What's that? How does that work? Who's that guy? And then you start to see these relationships, and then like a gesture or a raised eyebrow from an actor can be enough to sort of you're like, ooh, I see what just happened in that room, because you're connected to these relationships now. And that's part of what you're trying to be aware of as you're writing. Like, I don't have to re-explain things. I can now occupy that space where we all know roughly what's going on, and I'm building on what I've told you already.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yes.
As a follow-up question, we were wondering, what do you see as the responsibility and importance of this type of investigative journalism?
I don't have a clear answer to that. There are times where you feel like, okay, here's something that needs to be exposed or that people should know. But I have I'm more interested in this sort of story being able to be read in many ways. There is a kind of investigative journalism that, let's say the stuff we saw in the last few years with the Me Too kind of investigation, right? It's like, here's something that's been hidden and that we are going to investigate and expose. And it's been hidden because the people who it happened to and the people who did it both had their own reasons for not wanting it out there. And often that feedback loop of that has to be broken. And the same thing happens in politics or in all kinds of things, or in environmental reporting. There's all kinds of aspects to that. And that's interesting. I mean, it's totally thrilling, and even in crime reporting. And there is usually an agenda to that, right? Though I don't think that anybody who necessarily reported those stories, let's say the Me Too stories, necessarily that they would all agree 100% on how society should deal with the larger issues that were at play. I'm sure there was a range of views of that, that we should just pick off the top 5 predators, or we should completely rework the entire, social structures of work, or what have you. So their loyalty was to the facts of that story and to putting it together in a way that was really rock solid and that showed or let's say in the aftermath of certain kinds of George Floyd reporting, the systemic nature of something, right? Rather than so that's one of the things that's I think is interesting. So in my Abu Ghraib reporting, I was interested in showing that this was not, I was interested in showing what happened. And then I was interested in the characters, and I was interested in the misunderstandings and self-deceptions of players at all levels. But I was also interested in the fact that the kind of this was a strange story where an expose, the exposure of the photographs taken by American soldiers of the abuse that they were taking part in at this prison in Iraq, had become a kind of cover-up, because it had been the way that the system was able to say, look, you can see in the pictures, those are the bad guys. And I was like, no, those are the junior soldiers who are the image of a much larger system behind them. But it made it very easy for all the people higher up the chain just to say, that's disgusting, that's terrible, what depraved individuals, let's punish those lowest level soldiers. And so you had to actually sort of demonstrate the way the system created the structures that created the permission, that none of this could have happened if things were working correctly, right? And so showing how all of that works without simply making excuses for the people low down who also behave very badly is an interesting challenge. And so with something like that, there is a kind of purpose, an agenda. In the case of Rwanda, broadly, when I first went to write about it, there was a kind of general idea that like almost Hutus and Tutsis, like cats and dogs in cartoons, just, from time immemorial are programmed against each other and go in and kill each other. A very primitive view that made them sound primitive, right? To put it that way. And I wanted to show that it was in fact not chaos, but organized violence. That the way we spoke about it here was not accurate to what the experience was, that it was real politics were in play, the role of sort of a colonial history and all of that, but also just what was at stake for individuals who are caught up in it from all different directions. And so it's not like there's a single agenda to it. The funny thing is a lot of people have told me that afterwards I would hear from readers who said, I read your book and I became a humanitarian aid worker. And the book is extremely critical of humanitarian aid workers. If there's any one group that I'm pretty hard on, who are not themselves like villains, but who end up in a compromised position. So I always thought it was funny, like you can't account for how people are going to read something like that, because they would say, yes, I saw that. I saw that you were very hard on them and it made me want to do it right. Okay, what can I say? I hope you do. But it's an odd thing. It was not something I expected when I wrote it, that I would be getting that response. So I'm a little wary of being able to imagine what the response is in something like a book. With articles, it's different. You have a bit more of a sense. And certainly I've covered political campaigns, and there, you're whether or not you're trying to control the response, you're definitely playing right into the moment. You're writing for the moment. You're sort of responding to what everybody's already thinking about or keeping up with, and that's different.
Thank you. And this is a bit of a shift from our, I guess, from what our discussion has been about. But in 2002, you had written a book about a mid-20th century double homicide in Manhattan called A Cold Case, which is a pretty vast shift from your previous work. What inspired you to follow the true crime route? And how did you conduct your research into the double homicides?
So it's funny. I mean, there's a central character in there who's was the chief of investigations at the DA's office in Manhattan. So he's basically a detective. Technically, in the police structure, it's not his rank was not detective, but that was what he. And I was introduced to him by somebody who worked at the DA's office, who I knew, and who said, this guy's about to retire, and he's had a very, he's done all sorts of interesting cases, and it being the DA's office, he's been involved in all these investigations of financial crimes, all these other things. But he also has a couple of great stories of, criminal cases that he's taken a personal interest in. You might enjoy meeting him. Also, when he retires, he's about to open a bookstore. He might enjoy meeting you. He's moving to Providence, Rhode Island, or not Providence, Newport, Rhode Island. His wife's from Rhode Island. He'd recently remarried, and that's where they're going to go. So I go into the guy's office and I meet him. He was still at the DA's office, but like with a month to go. And I said something like, sort of, what's the case that you think about the most as you're like getting ready to retire? I was really making small talk. I did not think I was in there to come away with a story. And he starts telling me the story, and he tells it in like, I don't know, 25 minutes, maybe. I mean, long for a first meeting, but short for an overall story. And I thought, like, there it is. It's complete. It's got an investigation. This is one where there was a structure, right? It has a central character. It has all of this New York police but also New York history, because it reached back into like, they were all born in the 50s and 40s in New York City. They'd grown up in like the west side of Manhattan when that was like Irish gangster land and the killer. And it also interested me from the start that it was never a whodunit. It was known from the day of this double homicide in 1971 that who did it. It was the guy who had an argument in a bar and went back to the people's house and killed them. And he was a hoodlum. He was a guy who'd spent a lot of time in jails. And then he vanished. He like just flat out vanished. And he was a guy who was connected to a lot of people. Nobody could find him. And the police didn't look for him that much. And this inspector that I met had been friends with one of the victims. He'd known the victims. And it sort of just had occurred to him a few years ago, like, nobody ever found that guy. Let's see if we can find him. Let's see whatever happened to that. And he starts, so it becomes this investigation of the past. And it was called A Cold Case. This was before that was like a whole TV series title. So it was sort of something that I was interested in, as the idea of like the unsolved problem. And it had I was drawn to it in part because it had this tidy structure. But to me, it was really also about voices. I'd been doing a bunch of foreign reporting, and I was really, really happy to be working with untranslated, idiomatic, very kind of colorful personal English, like New York characters speaking New York English. Some of them, there were like a couple of them were real decent, those kind of old New York, and with the oi sounds in there, like the way they pronounce vowels. And there was also a kind of reporting side of it, which was like, there are some stories where everybody knows what the basic story is, who's in it, but nobody talks to everybody, right? So the detective never really spent any time with the criminal, except like when he caught him and interrogates him. They look at each other as adversaries. I'm moving between the two. I go to see him in jail. I go to see his wife, who's like living out in California where they'd been hiding. I go, she had chased away a New York Post guy with a garden hose, but I just went and like somehow started talking to her. I'm not trying to get in your house, through the screen door. And, oh, well, honey, come inside, and then we end up talking for a while. And it was fun reporting. And it kind of felt, it just felt very contained. And the language mattered to me. And the structure of crime stories, you know, to me, it wasn't so much a whodunit. It was a where did he go? And even that story didn't interest me past a point. It was like a procedural, but it was this moment when they catch him. And it's only, and the normal thing would be, that's kind of like the conclusion. And to me, it was like, that was the halfway point, because then it became, who is this guy? And I got totally interested in the criminal, and actually in his criminal defense attorney too. You know, one of these guys who's very smart, very skilled, and has dedicated his life to the side of the law that somebody has to do, and that the system depends on and justice depends on, but involves defending criminals and trying to get them off. So it was like looking at all of those kind of complicated moral conundrums and how people tell their stories about themselves and live with themselves. Because, you know, the obvious thing to do would be to think a criminal is ashamed or doesn't want to talk to you or so. But in fact, criminals are kind of proud of being good criminals. Bad guys admire other bad guys. They study other bad guys, you know? You see that in some of the mob movies, you know, the kid who's like watching the older guys and you realize he's like studying them the way that somebody else would be studying his baseball heroes or his writer heroes or whatever it would be. And I feel like it's important to give the dimensions of those people. They're not monsters, they're people. That's what makes them complicated, interesting, and a little bit scary. So it didn't feel as different as all that to me. Like, it sort of feels like in different ways, covering politics and covering crime are kind of the same. More than, I mean, I'd like to think covering politics seemed more noble, but I'm not sure.
Thank you. And you were also the editor of the Paris Review for a few years. And that's something that's always kind of intrigued me. I'm not sure what the editor of the Paris Review does. So I guess I wanted to ask you exactly, like, what does it mean to be the editor of that magazine?
So the editor of a magazine, it basically means running the whole thing, right? So you are in charge of deciding what goes in it, first of all. I mean, that's the sort of biggest obvious aspect of it, and sort of what is this magazine going to contain? If you were starting a magazine from scratch, you would be figuring that out from scratch. I was taking over a magazine that existed and had a long history. And so there was a sort of basic idea of what it was, which wouldn't have been that different anyway, which was publishes short fiction, it publishes some nonfiction, it publishes poetry, and it publishes very, very detailed, immersive interviews with writers. The Paris Review Writers Interview Series is like been part of its tradition now since it was founded in the late 50s. And it's one of the great archives, and they're wonderful. And they're done very differently from journalistic reporting. Like in journalistic interviews, you would never show, if you're writing for anything that is a news or journalism outlet, you would never let somebody see the article you're writing about them before it comes out, because they're going to try and change things or doctor it. It's like that would be there's an idea of integrity that goes around that, right? People say, oh, can I see my quotes? You can read certain things back to them, but you're not going to show them the exact context or how it's structured or anything. With the interviews at the Paris Review, it's a complete collaboration. And it's very interesting because they actually are better for that. You send back and forth the transcript, because it's like you're going to great writers. People are very established writers, accomplished writers, with a long track record, and you're talking about their lives, their work, and their working lives. Like, how do they go about things? Very mechanical questions about like writing. And basically what you're doing is you're extracting a long essay from them for free that they would never write even if you paid them, because it's a lot of work to think about those things. But you are bringing it out of them by talking to them and then editing it and shaping it and moving things around. So that running that operation, meaning you hire a few other editors, you start finding material. Sometimes you write to people to say, I would love it if you have some work that you would send us. And quite often you are looking for work that you don't know about. So you're having people, I mean, sometimes agents will send things. Quite often. You're also looking at books that are coming up that might have writers or material that's coming. And the Paris Review, like many literary magazines, is one of its things is to seek to publish first time, like to introduce new writers. And so you're looking, you know, that's hard because how do you find them? There's not like a system for reaching out to people that are not identified yet. So they have to find you and they have to get the stuff to you, which means we were reading things that were not solicited. I don't know what the policy on all of that is now. And then often those are writers who are really quite good, and sometimes they've been working like crazy on one or another story that's really polished, but sometimes it means they also need more editorial interaction. So it's developing those relationships with people. In the case of poetry, I'm not super knowledgeable about contemporary poetry. I like reading poetry, but I don't keep up. So I had poetry editors. Charles Simic, the poet who just died in the last couple of days, was one of my poetry editors, and I would just send piles of poems to them. He lived in New Hampshire at that point, and there was Megan O'Rourke, who's was the other one then, and they would go through them, and they would then show each other the ones they like, and then I would sort of look at them at the end. It also means, you know, it means dealing with printers. It means dealing with every aspect of the magazine. It means dealing with the archive. It means dealing with fundraising. It means dealing with hiring everybody who does all those things. It means managing the budget. It means, but doing all the redesign, doing all the art, overseeing all of that. So we did a big redesign, which I found interesting, you know, sort of figuring out everything from the font to the paper to go into the printing presses in Western Canada and supervising it and seeing how it's all put together. Because, you know what, one thing you forget sometimes when you think about literature, you're making stuff. You know, a sculptor knows that, right? A sculptor is chiseling away or shaping the clay in her hands, you know, but when you're writing, you're making a thing. It's going to be mass produced if it's published. And thinking about it that way and kind of keeping track of all those aspects of it matters, at least to me. Some writers don't care about it that much. I tend to remember, even with books I've read, the passages I care about. I kind of remember how they look on the page. So that, I mean, the editor does all of those things. But the most interesting work is when you're getting writing that you're excited about, and you're working with the writer, sort of saying maybe, I mean, there was an example of a good editor. Nathaniel Rich is a writer and editor who I had hired. He was like the first guy I hired. He was quite young, and somebody recommended him. And he came to me after a couple months and he said, there's a really good story by a guy who hasn't published a story before, who sent it in. But it's not quite right. And I've been doing some editing on it. And I just want to have a couple more days and then I want to show it to you. And I said, sure, you know. So he gives me the story. It's terrific. It's an excellent story. And it's basically about a young guy and his two buddies in a high school age sort of situation. Their fathers are serving in Iraq. But it's about them at home, sort of in the absence of their fathers. And I said, that's really good. So what did you do? You know, like what were you editing? It turned out there had originally been 3 friends. Because somewhere in this writer's head, that was probably truer to some, you know, relationships he had or was thinking of. Like, for whatever reason, he thought of it as like the main character and his 3 friends. And Nat said, you know, the fact is, it was hard to keep them straight. I studied it for a long time trying to figure out which one was the weakest, and it was pretty clear, but there were good things about him. And so I distributed some of those things amongst the other 2 in ways that seemed to make sense. And suddenly the whole thing feels more balanced. It just doesn't feel confusing. It feels tight. And I said, you know, amazing. I never would have thought of doing that. That's great. See what he says. If he's, and the writer thought it was a terrific solution. I mean, he agreed. As soon as he saw it, he was like, oh, you're right. I was always trying to figure out how to keep those guys going. And that 3rd one was the weakest. And it was a great solution. But that is what an editor can do, even with fiction. You know, with nonfiction, it's more obvious to us to imagine how you might edit something. But I've always thought of that story as I learned a lot from it.
Awesome. So I just want to make sure that we have time for a Q&A from the audience. We're a little short on time, but I'm wondering if you guys have thought of any questions you would like to ask Mr. Gourevitch. And yeah.
I wanted to ask, because you talked about how in your book there was, I'm calling it theme for, I guess, a lack of better word, of like dealing with the aftermath. That was one of the central points. And then in the cold case, you talked about how there was a focus on languages and how people tell stories about themselves. And I was wondering, how do you, because it reminded me of Hannah Krall's reportage to Out with God, where there is a underlying theme of memory and how we remember things. And I wanted to know, how do you find themes and motives in nonfiction, which is, because in fiction, well, you can choose a theme and go with it, so to speak. But in nonfiction, you can't just make something up by the rule of it. So does this kind of show itself to you, or do you find something, grab it, and then look into that point and ask questions to kind of reveal it yourself?
That's an excellent question, and different people go about it differently. So I know people who will think, and I've done a little bit of this at times within a story, where you think, I'm interested in this question, problem, dynamic set of issues, right? It can be a theme or it can be a set of issues, right? Now I need to find a couple of stories that contain, or in which, you know, I know this situation exists. Now I've got to find the people who can carry the story for me. And they literally speak of it almost like casting the story, but it's real world, it's reporting, but you're going through, I don't know, let's say you're trying to write a story about people who, a woman who's been denied abortion rights after this decision last year, right? Or about reproductive rights in a certain place. And you know what the themes and the issues are going to be, but you sort of want somebody who's kind of got the art. Okay, I know that I want somebody who's already a mother, and I want somebody who's, you know, not financially sort of completely self-sufficient. And so they need the system, or they interact with the system in other ways, or there are going to be these repercussions one way or the other in their life that I'm interested in, right? So then you start looking for those cases. You make connections to people who work with such people. And you start going through and you interview a number of people in order to find one or two, right, for the exemplary story. I don't tend to work that way, but that's because I often look for things that are big containers to begin with. So I am interested in stories where it's clear to me, I'm drawn to them because they click with themes that are already on my mind, right? So when I say, "Ooh, that's a good story," I'm not just meaning like, "Oh, that has dramatic possibility." I mean, that's a good story for me. Like, there are times where I will see something and think that's a good story, and I'll tell other writers or editors about it because it's like, I'd love to read this, but it's not for me. You know, it doesn't really make me want to spend 3-4 months working on it. But if I want to work on it, it usually means that's a story that connected to themes in my mind. Things that for one reason or another I've been thinking about, maybe things that I've written about before in another way. Some people obviously have beats. They tend to write even quite varied stuff, but they're writing about the theater or the Supreme Court or, you know, women's issues or, you know, a region or a culture. But that's, I try to move between things more, but obviously there's similar issues come up at times, or I'm drawn to a theme in a given place. So in Rwanda, as I say, there were these issues that I'd been thinking about in relationship to other stories I'd been doing that drew me into it. And when I was there, I just saw them more in these local terms. And the big questions like, what is common humanity and how do people deal with each other? And what are the stories we tell ourselves to reassure ourselves that we're not in the kind of danger these people are in? They're pretty on the surface on one level. And on the other hand, you have to draw them out. And that part of that happens in the interviewing, which is to say that if you and I interviewed the same people about the same basic subject, we'd come away with slightly different interviews. And you see that all the time when you read about somebody who's being interviewed. And both interviews are good. They're just different focuses. The writer Russell Banks, a novelist who died last week, and he'd written a lot of books and he'd given a lot of interviews. And I had interviewed him when I was in my early 30s, I guess. I had liked a couple of his most recent novels. And I'd looked it up because I had forgotten. I remembered it as a good interview, but that he'd had a lot to say that was interesting, but I forgot all of it. And so I looked it up and I forgot that I had presented it as like, I'd like to talk to you about how memory works in your work, right? So that the interview had a kind of theme. It could have been, and it became quite broad. In general, he talks about a number of his different books, but it stays quite focused on that. How he remembers things, how memory works for his characters versus how memory works in his own, because he had written a somewhat autobiographical novel. And he took it in places that I didn't expect, that I found interesting, sort of saying certain places that correspond to places where I lived at different times in my life are particularly rich for me for writing because they carry memory and a certain kind of memory of states of mind even. So, those things come that way with themes. You can introduce a theme and you don't know where it's going to go, or you look at a story and it hits that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for your question.
So I guess we went 10 minutes over our time here.
Okay.
But I think this is a good spot to conclude our session. This was really interesting. I took a lot of notes, about 2 pages of notes. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you all for having me. Thanks for that. Thanks for your good questions.
Awesome.
Take care.
So also, okay, guys, so we went over a little bit, but we have some writing exercises. We have the prompts still. If you would like to write them down, we're going to put them in the Zoom chat. And I guess we encourage you to try them out and see where it takes you. So I'm going to paste the first one. And the second one.
The first is about, Philip's, and the second is about Radhika's.
And you can, I guess, copy this if you're doing this on your computer. You can copy these into Word document, write them down, screenshot them. But I think this is where we end our first session. Thanks so much for, this was really cool. Thanks so much for coming,
everybody for coming, and hopefully we'll see you at the other events today and tomorrow.
Yeah, thank you all so much. It's been so great, and to hear these authors speak, and also to hear some of your wonderful questions. So thank you all so much.
We'll be interviewing Teju Cole later today, which will be
with the same link for Zoom.
Yeah, same Zoom link. Hopefully you all got it. If you have any friends who didn't get it or who might be interested, also invite them. That would be cool. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.